Here we are in unit number 7, and here we're going to have a short discussion about the arguments for the existence of God. There are 4 traditional arguments, and the objective that we have in this particular unit is for you to come to understand the 4 traditional arguments. They are the cosmological argument, the teleological argument, the ontological argument, the moral argument. I also want you to be able to recognize and understand something of Pascal's wager, because it bears on arguments for the existence of God. We'll put those together, and these arguments will be aspects of arguments that will come up under Augustine, under Aquinas, under Descartes, and Locke, Hume, and debates about that subject as well. So I thought it's best to have one place where you can find all these arguments. You'll find various places in the textbook arguments, these arguments being considered. I put them here in one place. And while I want you to recognize the form of these arguments come in the form of a syllogism, I'm going to give you some background information on each of them so that you'll be able to recognize them more easily and distinguish them. So let's start off with the first of these. It's the cosmological argument. And before we move to it, let's observe that I've divided these 4 arguments into pairs of 2. The 2 that are based on experience, if you like, Aristotelian arguments, and the 2 that are based on pure reason, if you like, Platonic reason. So we'll start off first with the cosmological argument, and before we do that, let's just pause for a moment and make some distinguishing comments in relation to terms. Theology is the study or the science of the knowledge of God. Study of God. Natural theology is the study of God using natural intellect, natural knowledge. The theologian who's particularly famous for this is Thomas Aquinas. Natural theology is sometimes called philosophical theology or rational theology. That's to be contrasted with revealed theology, which is knowledge of God based on special revelation, the Bible or the church, or special revelation of some kind, God speaking to his people. Of course, in philosophy, we're interested in the natural arguments or the rational arguments or reasoning and seeing their value. Why do this? Well, if natural theology, philosophical theology, if you will, if it does derive some knowledge of God's existence and perhaps some knowledge of his nature, then it might be successful and useful. And if it happens to be true, then it might bear on the concept of answering the big questions of human experience, salvation, life after death, and things of that kind. Again, you can look at Reformed epistemology, which is a modern movement in the Protestant tradition. The Catholic tradition is found in terms of Thomas Aquinas, and there are a number of others, but just some of you might be interested in that. I'll leave that for you to see. All right, back to the 4 traditional arguments. We're starting off with the cosmological argument, and as we come to the cosmological arguments, make a couple of preliminary observations. This argument is based upon the concept that the universe is here, and the universe is here, but it's clear that it couldn't just happen. Something had to cause it. That's an inference drawn from an observation. The outline of the argument, or the general thesis, this world can't cause itself. That's a very important one. Can the world cause itself? And secondly, it cannot cause itself out of nothing. Now, you might be able to argue it can cause itself, but can it cause itself out of nothing? It could not be an effect in an infinite series of causes and effects. Now, that's a rational discussion about endless regression. And it's a technical argument, but nonetheless it's a very significant one. And hence the conclusion is there must be an ultimate first cause. Now, the categorical formulation of this argument goes like this. All contingent being depends for its existence on some uncaused being. The world is viewed here as being a contingent being, inherently dependent upon something. The cosmos is a contingent being. Therefore, the conclusion the cosmos depends for its being on some uncaused being. This is a brief aside, though directly linked not just to the cosmological argument, but to some of the other arguments, are the arguments that Thomas Aquinas put forward for the existence of God. As a passionate follower of Aristotle, not surprisingly that he would focus on the arguments consistent with knowing about God through human experience. He had 5 ways, and I've listed them here for you in the course. I'm not going to go over them in detail now, other than simply mention them to you here. If you are looking at this topic, you can use this as a resource. These are the 5 ways. At the heart of his arguments is necessary existence and causation, of course, design when it comes to the teleological argument. And there are a number of problems with all of these, the problems with causality itself. I'm going to leave you to look at these questions. They're questions which are posed in a number of different directions. Let you look at those. When we come to look at Hume is going to give one of the most outstanding critiques of the concept of causation. And behind that critique is that you can certainly draw inferences about causation, but you cannot draw any certainties about it. In other words, knowledge about causation is, in a sense, not really available to us. We didn't experience it, we can infer it, but there are fundamental problems with arguments from experience. And so Hume's criticism is very important. It is accepted by people like Kant, although he goes on to approach the arguments for the existence of God in terms of the moral argument, and the rest of Thomas' ways are discussed for you there. So there's a little aside for you that might be helpful to you. I'll leave you to look at these. A couple of comments on the cosmological argument you might find interesting. Kalam's famous structure for it, and there's a fun observation by Robert Jastrow concerning scientists and the arguments for the existence of God. It's an interesting work that he wrote called God and the Astronomers. I'll leave you to read that. You can enjoy it for yourself if you're interested. If you're not, just leave it, because the purpose in this is to look at these arguments and know them. So we looked at the cosmological argument, now we're turning to the teleological argument, another argument based on experience, another Aristotelian argument, if you will. And again, we're going to see the background to it. It comes from the word telos, meaning design and purpose. So the first argument is on causation. The world can't have caused itself. The second argument is on design and purpose. It's very much linked to Thomas's 5th way. And again, you'll see that I've set out these arguments, the 4 of them, set out in the form of a syllogism on the pink slide, so that you can go back through the slides and identify where those syllogisms are. And here you have basically William Paley's presentation of it, the watchmaker. Watches, houses, ships, machines, all exhibit design, and they are planned and produced by an intelligent being, or by intelligent beings. The universe exhibits design, therefore the universe was planned and produced by an intelligent being. That's the structure of it, and a few other comments. Charles Darwin's interest in the topic, you may be quite surprised by that, you might look at that, find that interesting. F.R. Tennant's on theistic evolution, a view of evolution that's consistent with the idea of the heavens and the earth, and some other comments about Western traditions for you there. But again, I want you to focus on recognizing the 4 arguments. That brings us now to the first of the a priori arguments, and often the one which is the most challenging for students to even comprehend, because it's so different from what you're experiencing. But it's helpful because when we come to consider Descartes' discussions and his whole proof for being able to know about things in the world, understanding at least something of the ontological argument becomes important. So there's a foundational issue which may help us if we look at it. We're talking not about a linguistic model. Remember, that would be more Aristotelian. But this is more Platonic, where the idea or the concept is at the heart of this. And at the heart of this is to ask three questions. I've got them for you here. To exist as an idea in a mind only. Now, let's just pretend that we can create in our minds the idea of God. I don't mean to be blasphemous for those of you who are religious, but let's just come up with the idea of God. And the second question is to exist in the mind and in the real world. To actually exist as well as exist in the mind. The question is, which is greater? Obviously, to exist in the mind and to exist in reality is the greater. And it's necessary for this idea of God in this sense to have some data put inside it. We have to conceive of this God as being perfect and the greatest and the most fantastic idea that could exist. And so that means that this idea of God excludes other ideas. It totally encompasses all of perfection itself, the most perfect being you can imagine. So these questions are asking you to conceive of God as the most perfect being, nothing missing from him, he is most perfect. And then to say, okay, he exists in my mind, there is full of perfection. And which is greater, to simply exist in my mind or to exist in the world of reality as well? Answer, exist in both the mind and the world. That's the background to the argument. Anselm is famous for discussing this and coming up with a discussion of the ontological argument. Again, it's revolving around concepts of the most perfect or the most perfect being or the greatest possible being. I think for our purposes, you could have here Descartes' version of it and come back to when you're dealing with Descartes. But here is the summary of it in the form of a syllogism. God is the greatest and most perfect being. So you've got this idea God is the most perfect. A being who exists is greater and more perfect than a being who doesn't exist. Therefore, God must exist. Well, I hope that's helped you to get the grasp of the argument. But this argument introduces a very important concept which is going to come up again in Descartes, and it is the concept of existence as a predicate. And it's going to be an issue which is going to frustrate people in some respects. Descartes' famous cogito ergo sum argument is built around it. It and necessary existence. But we'll come back to that. Let's not get lost in that now. Let's go back and remember that's what's important for us at this point in time. So Norman Malkovich has an interesting formulation of it and discussion of it. Let's come down to the last one, the moral argument of the existence of God. This is the argument which Kant put forward in his Critique of Practical Reason. It's based on a special kind of experience, the experience of moral reality. And yet, it's not based on experience. It's an inferred kind of experience. It's one that, and it's an inferred necessary experience. And it's built around the idea of moral law with a capital M and a capital L, moral law. So let's first look at that. Here, when we talk about moral law, as distinct from moral laws, moral law is that objective sense of absolute moral principles. The concept of justice as being a moral norm, a moral law which all human beings necessarily know out of which we draw all kinds of inferences, which are moral laws. The moral laws themselves may differ in culture and circumstances, but behind all of these moral laws is the moral law itself. If you can begin to grasp that, you're beginning to grasp the basis of the argument. And here you see it again in the categorical syllogism form. Not a categorical, in the form of a syllogism. If there's an absolute moral law, again hypothetical, then there must be an absolute mind as its basis. Now the categorical statement, there is an absolute moral law. Therefore, there must be an absolute mind as the basis of the moral law. This moral argument for the existence of God has been modified by various people. Bertrand Russell and Frederick Copleston had an interesting debate about this. You can find the video online. You might find it interesting to look at. C.S. Lewis, in his famous book Mere Morality, modified Kant's argument, and his C.S. Lewis form has become very popular in the English-speaking world. Some of you may have even heard about C.S. Lewis. And again, I'm going to avoid Descartes' discussions here. Pascal's wager, the last one for us. Here we have the summary of it. Pascal is interesting in terms of his own personal life. He's best known for the vacuum flask. He was a scientist, a mathematician. He began publishing on religious topics and had a religious experience. And he found himself very much on the wrong side of established religious authority. He is famous for his famous wager, which is built around the concept that if you think about a bet, then obviously you want to make the best bet possible with the best odds of success. And his argument is set out for you in red on the screen. If God does not exist, one will lose nothing by believing in him. But if he does exist, you will lose everything by not believing in him. The concept here being that if God exists, then there is life after death. If God exists, there is a heaven and a hell. If God exists, those who believe in him go to heaven. If God exists, and those who don't believe in him go to hell. Hence the basis of the bet. If God doesn't exist, by believing him, I haven't lost a thing during this life. But if he does exist, and I don't believe in him, then I have certainly made a bad bet. And his concept was, it's worth the gamble believing in God. Again, coming back to the essentials of this course, essentials for this course and for this unit, I want you to be able to recognize the cosmological argument, the teleological argument, the ontological argument, the moral argument. Have a concept of it at least in your mind and understand Pascal's wager. Already as we've gone through this, I've referred to other materials. You may find it helpful later when you're looking at Descartes or when you're looking at Thomas Aquinas or you're looking at Kant to come back to these slides. You might view these as supplemental to those philosophers and those sets of slides and those videos.